Stuka Joe here, and we're about to begin turn 6 of this playthrough of Red Typhoon. And as we saw in turn 5, the Russians are behind schedule, and they must attack and take some risks. And in this sector, the sector held by the WR and Kalinin front, it seems that this is the sector where they have the best chance of creating a huge breakthrough. So on with the Soviet activation point phase. And the Soviets receive 6 activation points. They don't have any from prior turns, so 6 is all she wrote for this one. And now we proceed to the Soviet movement phase. The Soviets spend their first activation point to activate the WR front for movement. Here we see the units of the WR front north of Gazatsk prior to movement, and here are the positions after movement, and we see practically a complete advance against the Germans of the 9th Army. We will probably see attacks here and here designed to surround these units and possibly cause some retreats, and then maybe they'll take a chance against those 2 German units. We'll see how the attacks develop. Remember, attacks don't have to be pre-designated. And here are the positions after movement around Gazatsk and to the south. And we see that the Soviets will attempt to dislodge those 2 panzer divisions and cross the river. The breakthrough attempt to succeed needs also the cooperation of the Kalinin front in weakening or destroying these German infantry divisions of the 9th Army. So, a second activation point is spent to activate the Kalinin front for movement. Here are the positions of the Kalinin front units north of Rezev before movement, and here are the positions after movement. We see the hexes occupied by the Kalinin front are fully stacked, and we'll probably see attacks against various German units along this line in the combat phase. Looking towards the south in the sector of the German 4th Army, that army retreated in the last turn. So the Soviets, their WL front, must spend an activation point to move its units and take that ground that has been given practically for free. And the same situation happens with the Bryansk front further to the south. The Germans just handed the victory point city of Orel. So that means that in order to capture that ground, the Soviets would have to spend 2 of their 4 activation points. So the Soviets spend their 3rd activation point to activate the WL front for movement. Here are the positions of its units before movement, and here are the positions after movement. They've advanced timidly towards the 4th Army. Now, the Soviets must spend an activation point if they want to take Orel from the Germans. So their 4th activation point is spent to activate the Bryansk front for movement. And here we see the positions of the units of the Bryansk front before movement. And here are the positions after movement. Orel is now in Soviet hands. With 2 activation points left and attacks needed to be made in the WR and Kalinin fronts, the Soviets will not activate their northwest front. And you see there is a small gap here, but the Germans don't have forces in the vicinity to really exploit that. So now on to the Soviet combat phase. And we will be seeing attacks by the WR and Kalinin fronts. And we'll spend both activation points that remain to activate those 2 fronts for attack. So we take a look at the Kalinin front. Here we see the German 253rd Infantry Division being attacked by 6 Soviet units, including 2 breakthrough units. This is a 4-to-1 attack with a -1 because the defenders are in woods. And the Soviets roll a 1, which is modified to a 0 contact, so all units remain in place. So things begin badly for the Soviets. Next, 4 Soviet units of the WR front, totaling 19 combat factors, will be attacking these 2 units of the German 9th Army, and they are surrounded by zones of control. If called to retreat, they will be eliminated, but this is a 2-to-1 attack with no modification. We roll 1d6. The result is a 4, just what the Soviets needed. Defender retreat 1 hex. Defending German units cannot retreat into any hex that is not in an enemy zone of control, so they are eliminated. The Soviets occupy the vacated hex. Next attack, 4 Soviet units of the WR front, 17 combat factors against the German 110th Infantry Division with 4. This is a 4-to-1 attack with a -1 because the Germans are in woods. The result is a 6 modified to a 5. Defender retreats 3 hexes. The Germans can't retreat. They are surrounded by enemy units and zones of control. So the 110th is eliminated, and the Soviets can occupy the vacated hex. And as we can see, the Soviets are not in strength in this area. Let's take a look further to the south. Here we see 4 Soviet units, 21 combat factors against 9 in these 3 German panzer divisions. That's a 2-to-1 attack, but with no modification. And note that if the Soviets would have attacked Gazatsk, this would have been a 2-to-1 attack with a -2 for the city and the river. So we roll 1d6, and the result is a 4, just enough for a DR1. The Germans retreat 1 hex and are disrupted, and the Soviets advance. And that concludes the attacks by the WR front and the Kalinin front. The Soviets have no more activation points, and that's the end of the Soviet combat phase. We skipped the first shock army withdrawal phase because it's withdrawn already, as well as the airborne phase, and now we proceed to the partisan phase. The Soviets have 1 partisan unit for this turn. This is the last partisan unit that will enter the game. We roll 1d6, and the result is a 4. And as we see, partisan area 4 is the closest one to the front so far. So the Soviets placed their partisan unit there. Now to the Soviet recovery phase, but there are no disrupted Soviet units. So that's the end of turn 6 for the Soviets. This turn was fairly productive in eliminating German units. 3 more German infantry divisions join the dead pile. And with Soviet forces threatening the center of the map, now we go to German turn number 6, on to the German activation point phase. Germans receive 5 activation points. They didn't have any remaining from previous turn, so Germans have 5 to spend now. The Soviets have just breached the German lines near Stichevka, and they're about to drive a wedge between the German 9th Army and the 4th Panzer Army. The Germans only have 5 activation points, and we see there some of their units of the 2nd Panzer Army well positioned to take care of a unit of the WL front, but that would burn an activation point. The 4th Army has held its line fairly well, but Russian units are about to break out near Kirov. Perhaps the 4th Army should fall back a little more and give up Yuknov. The situation with the 4th Panzer Army is more delicate because if they withdraw to try to obtain a better defensive position, they will leave 3 panzer divisions which are disrupted behind. Those cannot move. And the Ninth Army is practically breaking in front of the Russian horde. So we'll see movements from the Ninth Army and 4th Panzer Army, and perhaps the 4th Army. So the Germans spend their first activation point to activate the Ninth Army for movement. The Ninth Army is currently reduced to only 5 infantry divisions, and all of them are in contact with the enemy, and if nothing is done, they will be probably eliminated in the next turn. So here are the positions before movement and the positions after movement. We have 2 German divisions falling back on Olenino. Now the Germans spend their second activation point to activate the 4th Panzer Army for movement. And the 4th Panzer Army has to establish contact with the 9th Army, or that wedge between both of the armies will grow. So this is the position before movement, and these are the positions after movement. Units of the 4th Panzer Army in this area have moved north to seal any gaps here. The disrupted units stay in their place, and now it falls upon the 4th Army to seal any gaps and prevent a wedge from forming between them and the 4th Panzer Army. So the Germans spend their third activation point to activate the 4th Army for movement. We see this partisan unit dangerously close to Vyazma, and partisans for the Soviets, to be activated, their formation is the white colored one. So by burning an activation point, the most you can do is move partisans and the paratroopers. So it's a very tempting target, Vyazma, for the Soviets in the next turn. So these are the positions of the 4th Army before movement. These are the positions after movement. This German division is protecting Vyazma from the partisans, and hopefully in the next turn they'll be able to deal with those pesky partisans. We see that the Germans solidified their line with that of the 4th Panzer Army, even though they gave up some ground, but they're not giving up Yuknov. Now, taking a look at the sector of the 2nd Panzer Army, 3 of their units have a Soviet unit surrounded in the woods, but the rest of their units are stretched out pretty thin. So will they move, or they will stay in place? The Germans spend their 4th activation point to activate the 2nd Panzer Army for movement. Here are the units of the 2nd Panzer Army before movement, and here are the positions after movement. The Germans have 1 activation point, malditas. The Germans have 1 activation point left that could be used to activate the 2nd Panzer Army for combat and try to eliminate that surrounded Soviet unit, but the Germans have other problems to worry about. 3 partisan units behind enemy lines. The partisans in Zone 4 are pretty much under control. However, the partisans in Zone 6 are unchecked and are 2 marches away from Roslav, and that's a Soviet victory point city. There are units of the reserve formation at Yartsevo, but there are also Soviet partisans in Zone 1, 2 marches away from Veliz or Demidov. So it's time to activate the reserve formation. The Germans activate the units of the reserve formation, spending their last activation point for movement. Here we see the German 208th Infantry Division at Spas-Demensk before movement and after movement. Here we see 2 German divisions at Yartsevo before movement and after movement. There are several units of that same formation which are facing the units of the Northwest Front. This is the positions of those units before movement, and after movement they've fallen back to positions behind rivers or in wooded terrain. And that's the end of the German movement phase. To the German combat phase. Now the Germans have no activation points left, but in this game, German panzer divisions can attack without spending activation points. So those 3 German panzer divisions of the 2nd Panzer Army will attack the surrounded Soviet unit. This is a 3-to-1 attack with a -1 for the wooded terrain of the defenders. We roll 1d6. A 3 modified to a 2, DR1. Defender retreats 1 hex. And because the defender is surrounded by enemy zones of control and enemy units, it is eliminated. And the Germans occupy the vacated hex, and they have now strong positions behind the river. There are no more attacks by German panzer units, so that's the end of the German combat phase. Now we proceed to the German recovery phase. The Germans have 3 panzer divisions of the 4th Panzer Army to the south of Gazatsk, which are disrupted and are now flipped to their front sides. And that's the end of the German recovery phase and the end of turn number 6. So this turn number 6 saw strong Soviet attacks and advances along the center of the front. The Germans fell back, plugged the line. The partisans are now threatening certain victory point cities, and the Germans are now stretching their lines with 2 units per hex. Will they be able to hold the line for 1 more turn? There's 3 more to go. So this is Red Typhoon, and this is Stuka Joe signing off for now. Thanks for watching.